102.2 Auckland. The Radio Wammo Breakfast.
The voice of the creative economy.
With Vincent Heeringa.
From Idealog magazine at Tangible Media, it is Vincent. Good morning, Vincent.
Hi, Wammo.
And today talking about the relaunch of Idealog, because like everything in the world, if you don't adapt and change, well, you very soon disappear, I suppose. So you guys are changing your spots to stripes?
Well, yeah. That was stripy spots.
Stripy spots.
Spotty stripes. Well, we're 5 years old now, and you're quite right, Wammo. You got to change, and you got to adapt. So, I've had my head down, and we've been working incredibly hard to relaunch Idealog, which happens next week. So I just wanted to tell you about it, because it's been an interesting process of going right back to basics. We started way back in January with a kind of a session with invited guests to tell us about, let them tell us who they thought Idealog was, what the opportunity was, and build it back up from scratch again.
And what sort of feedback were you getting?
Well, it's kind of humbling. It's at the one level really great. They love the product, but also kind of the feeling that in some ways it started with a raw, but had more potential to grow. And that one of the interesting observations about what's happened in the last 5 years is a lot of the stuff that Idealog used to write about now has become mainstream. And what the two examples that were brought up were TVNZ and Air New Zealand, both quite large companies, both quite traditional companies in the sense that they report to shareholders and they employ hundreds of people, thousands of people in Air New Zealand's case. But both have the word we like to use is Idealog themselves, in the sense that they've kind of reimagined their business. Particularly, you think about the way that both brands express themselves online now. Huge users of social media, a huge emphasis on marketing and brand development and technology development. And the point was made that maybe it's time to go more mainstream with Idealog, given that the mainstream has kind of moved towards us. So we're kind of moving towards each other in a firm embrace.
So what does that mean?
That means that whereas in the past we've written a lot about individual entrepreneurs who are going out and making it happen, mortgaging their house and off they go, we'll also be writing about larger companies and bigger issues to do with New Zealand, the New Zealand economy and New Zealand politics. It also means that 6 times a year is not good enough. And so we're relaunching our website, which was just a kind of a blog of interesting stuff. We're doing a daily news service. I don't know whether you've noticed our Twitter feed recently, Wammo, but it's gone crazy. We're pushing up to 5,000 now in terms of followers.
Yeah.
And employed the wonderful Esther Go, who is pumping out 3-4 times a day tweets, and then she'll be heading up our online effort as well, which will be generating daily news.
And so does that mean that there's been a shuffle round of staff who've been at Idealog for a long time?
It does. Matt Cooney, who was the founding editor and has been there since we started in 2005, has moved on, and he is now the head of digital development for the entire Image Centre group.
Yeah. And
we've hired the wonderful Hazel Phillips
from NBR
to be the editor of Idealog.
So what does it actually translate to for the end user? I mean, what are some examples of some stories that they're likely to see?
Well, I'll give you a good example. We probably in the past wouldn't have written about the dairy industry, just because that's kind of farming and it's not particularly innovative and certainly not very cool. But now we're kind of thinking, well, geez, if Idealog has anything to say about growing this New Zealand economy, we ought to have an opinion or ought to have a take on dairy farming, and not just from the from a sustainability point of view, which is perhaps where we might have come in the past. And so the cover story next week that's coming out is a very cool story about Sam Morgan, the founder of Trade Me, who has invested in a dairy farm and a milk brand in Brazil. And why that's interesting for us is, well, first of all, we're so used to the story of people coming into New Zealand and buying dairy farms, and particularly, the paranoia at the moment and the xenophobia actually is about Chinese interests coming in and buying New Zealand dairy farms. Well, here's an example of New Zealand investors going out and buying dairy farms elsewhere. So that's kind of interesting, is exporting New Zealand dairy farming knowledge and technology. But the second thing that's interesting about it is the yields they get off their grasses is effectively 3 times as much as New Zealand dairy, and so they can produce just so much more. Just so much more milk as a result of the growing conditions there, and that raises quite an interesting problem for New Zealand because we fancy ourselves as a very verdant country, that can produce high quality milk. Well, they can do that in Brazil too. Yeah.
Okay, so that's one example of a story. So with this shift and change in focus at Idealog, what happens to the stories about those new up and coming entrepreneurs who are coming up with new innovative ideas here in New Zealand?
I'd like to have my cake and eat it too. Wammo, can I do that? I mean, we'd like to keep all those guys, and by going daily with the daily news online, we'll actually just have huge capacity for carrying so many more stories than what we have in the past. So, while the magazine, still will come out 6 times a year, the daily aspect of the website, and then down the line, hopefully our tablet app will be able to just carry so much more content. I actually think it's a real sign of health in New Zealand that so many of the companies that we've tracked as startups and kind of as interesting small companies are now quite big. They're actually quite significant contributors to New Zealand economy, and that's the bit that I want to latch onto. We want to grow with those companies.
Okay, all right. Well, let's move on. Okay, so look out for the new Idealog coming out next month. Now, the other thing...
Next week, in fact. And we go live on Wednesday. It may be Wednesday, 11:59 at night, but it will be Wednesday.
Okay. Let's look on to the other thing we want to talk about was a very cool graphic, a smartphone appographic.
Yeah, is that in your... Are you displaying that on your site at the moment?
You can, if you're watching the live video stream, you'll be able to see it, but let's explain it.
Well, it's from an app developer called XCube. Maybe it's called CrossCube, but it's XCube.com, XCubeLabs.com. And they have a fantastic blog. And one of the things on their blog is a kind of graphic that displays the evolution of the various application platforms or smartphone platforms. And there's just some very interesting comparisons there, and obviously Apple by far in a way the winner, or the dominant player in that space. And there's but interesting just how fast Android is catching up, right?
Yeah. It says that I was reading it before that Android is catching up. In fact, in the future, by the end of June this year, Android market is predicted to have only 40,000 apps less than the Apple App Store for iPhone, and will close the remaining gap before the end of July 2011.
That's amazing, isn't it? Yeah. So, Apple certainly dominate and have stolen the march, but is that because Android is just so much more available on kind of handsets? Is it driven by handsets?
Across so many different devices, Samsung, HTC, Sony devices as well. So it's the only problem that the Android market is having is getting people to pay for apps, but apparently that is also changing and turning around as the quality of sort of premium apps come on board, and people who were developing for iPhone have started developing for Android. Yes. People are more likely to start paying for apps.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But the revenue curve for apps across all platforms is astounding.
It is astounding. I'm looking at one infographic they've got here on XCube Labs, which shows that the by mid-2011, which will be pretty much now, I guess, we're looking at about $3.8 billion spent on downloading apps. And that's up from, within just 3 years, that's up from 0.2. So phenomenal growth, you know, what that the app market has developed.
Yeah, very, very cool. All right, we'll check that out at xcubelabs.com. Vincent, we will check out the new Idealog next week.
Yeah, well, I really hope it goes well. We're working incredibly hard, and check out the Idealog Mag Twitter feed. It's going off.
Excellent. All right, that's Idealog Mag on Twitter. Thanks, Vincent. Cheers. Here is Motor